Next, I'd like to introduce Denise Daniels. Dr. Denise Daniels is currently the Hudson T. Harrison Endowed Chair of Entrepreneurship at Wheaton College's Department of Business and Economics. Denise has studied economics, business, psychology, and organizational behavior, and has served at Seattle Pacific University as Associate and Interim Dean in the School of Business, Government, and Economics, as well as served as Associate Vice President for Strategic Initiatives. While at SPU, Denise was executive producers of, I think it's 3 seasons of a wonderful documentary film and course series called Faith and Company. I encourage you to check that out. And she still serves on the board of the Theology of Work project. Denise also authored one of our favorite books on spiritual formation in the workplace titled Working in the Presence of God, Spiritual Practices for Everyday Work, which we have copies of available. We are honored to welcome Dr. Denise Daniels to be with us today.
Thanks, Steve. Well, good morning. It's nice to see you all. So I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about this morning, and as Steve mentioned, I wrote a book called Working in the Presence of God, came out about 2.5 years ago, and then just several months after it came out, the pandemic hit and everything changed, right? And I don't know about you all, although I'm going to ask you to raise your hands here in a minute and get a sense of how things have changed. But life changed pretty dramatically for me. I actually moved across the country and went from one job to another. And in my new job at Wheaton College, I moved in the summer of 2020. So it was actually a really chaotic season of trying to sell a house when you could only have 2 people in the house at the same time, the realtor and one other person. So if you had a couple, somebody had to stand on the front porch and somebody else had to go through the house, and then trying to figure out how to pack up all of our stuff. And we couldn't give anything away because, Goodwill was closed. And so we were stuck with trying to figure out what we were going to do with downsizing things and navigating all of that, and then driving across the country with, at the time we had in the car 3 kids and a dog, and we have 4 kids. We left one in Seattle, and then it was a complicated scenario. I got to my new job, and I actually didn't meet my department chair for 10 months in person because we were encouraged not to come into the office because of COVID. I taught online, so I actually didn't meet students face-to-face. It was a very disruptive time. And so here I had just written this book about how we experience God in the everyday rhythms of our lives, and all of a sudden I had no more rhythms to my work life. And so I think disruption has really become kind of the new normal over the past couple of years. Disruption in where we work, disruption in how we work, and even whether we are working. And so I started to kind of wonder and think about this question of how do we experience God's presence in the midst of that disruption, in the midst of the things that are constantly coming up and different than what they have been before. And so I'm going to talk about 3 practices today. And these practices actually are in the book in one way, shape, or form. But there are 3 practices that I think are particularly helpful for a time of disruption. And so I'm going to be talking about how to surrender to God, how to lament, and how to express gratitude. So those are the three practices that I want to talk about. Before I get too far into this, though, I want to ask you all about some of your own experiences in terms of life and work disrupted. How many of you have worked from home at some point in the last couple of years? Virtually, not all of you, but almost all of you. Actually, maybe who has not worked from home? And that's the more interesting ones. we could talk about those. Many of us are working digitally in ways that we haven't worked before. I went from teaching classrooms in person to teaching on Zoom, which is not nearly as fun or engaging or interesting for anyone, me or them. There has been changes to the content of our work in many cases as we're trying to adapt to what's happening. Obviously, new rhythms and sometimes no rhythms in the same way. New coworkers. Many people have left their jobs. We've talked about the great resignation of the past year, where we literally have seen people leaving jobs at unprecedented rates in the United States. A lot of fear surrounding work, and initially that was fear about getting sick. Later on, it was fears about, am I going to be able to move up? Am I going to be able to get promoted? And loss of work for a lot of people for one reason or another. I'm an academic, so I like data, and so I'm going to read you some numbers because this is something that I think is really interesting. You may or may not pretend like you like it. So here is some of the data that I found about flexible work over the last year to two. 70% of workers want flexible work options to continue. They want to have some type of work from home or hybrid alternatives available to them. So that's a real change from 2+ years ago. At the same time, 65% really wish they could spend more time in person with their teams. So there's these conflicting demands and desires, right? We want more flexibility and we want to be together with people that we work with. I think it's really interesting. 61% of people who are in leadership positions say that they are thriving right now. I think that's actually really high. And it's encouraging. What's not so encouraging are the people who are not in leadership positions, and particularly young people. So Gen Z and younger Gen X, or not Gen Xers, Gen Y, millennials, younger millennials are really not thriving in the workplace. So I'm looking around the room and I'm like, okay, many of you are probably in this 20s to early 30s category. 60% of those folks say that they are surviving or flat out struggling right now. That's a concern. That's a real concern when we think about the workplace and what work means. 54% of people feel overworked, and 2 in 5 say that they are exhausted every day. So another concern when you start to think about what does work look like and what does it mean. People who are younger are more likely to struggle balancing work with life. Many of them have just gotten into the workforce, and all of a sudden there is no workforce to be, there's no workplace to be in, and they're struggling with how do you balance your time and how do you do what you're supposed to do. They also feel exhausted after a typical day of work. They're much more likely than older people to report that. Many of these 20s and early 30s talk about feeling disengaged or not excited at work, and they have a hard time getting in a word at meetings, and they have a hard time bringing new ideas to the table, which I also think is interesting and concerning. 1 in 6 people have cried with a colleague at some point during the pandemic. Probably not what we would have seen numerically in 2019. Somewhere between 40 and 50% of people have talked about their plans to move, whether that's physically move to a new location because of remote work, or move the type of work, or move jobs in the coming year. So that's another thing that we're just seeing a lot of shifts. So just out of curiosity, how many of you have changed jobs since March of 2020? Okay, so about half of you, it looks like. So you're consistent with this data. How many of you feel like the workload itself has become overwhelming at times because of the pandemic? About a third of you, maybe half? Okay. How many of you have made a major career shift or transition during the last couple of years? Okay, again, these are higher numbers than we've seen before. So this is life and work disrupted. We're seeing a lot of changes happening in the workplace. And I guess one of the questions that I started to think about, because, when you write a book on spiritual practices in the workplace and then God all of a sudden takes the workplace away, it's like, okay, God, what are you doing? So one of the things I've started asking myself, but also I'd like for you all to kind of start thinking about and asking is, what's God up to? What might be God trying to say to you? And how could you pay attention to what God is doing in your own workplace, in your own work lives, in your own lack of work, potentially? What is God up to? So that's the question that I want to start with. And I also want to frame our time with this phrase, ora et labora. And this is a Latin phrase. It means pray and work. This phrase was actually used really regularly by Brother Lawrence. Some of you may have heard of him. He was a Benedictine monk in France in the 1600s. And he talked a lot about this idea of, you can be in the kitchen peeling potatoes. I'm actually not sure if it was a peeling potatoes example, but in my mind, that's what he was doing. But he's working in a monastery and doing kind of mundane drudgery work. And he talked about the idea that God really wanted to encounter him in his daily work. He wanted to experience the presence of God in his daily work. And so he used this notion of pray and work, that you could do those things at the same time. Pray and work and pray. That sometimes our work becomes a prayer to God, and sometimes we can pray in the midst of our work and bring our work to God. And there's this kind of back and forth as we're working between experiencing God's presence and hearing from God and bringing our concerns to God with that ora et labora notion. And so may we be people who can say, Lord, I offer my prayer as my work and my work as my prayer. So I want to kind of frame this as this ora et labora concept that on the one hand, I think sometimes we think about the contemplative life, that the life of a monk as kind of all you do is pray. And sometimes that's attractive to us, and we think about, I'd like to do that, or I'd like to not have to worry about my work so much. And then other times we think about, I need to get my work done, and my work is sort of frantic and never ending. And these two poles seem somehow divorced from each other. We talk about kind of doing our quiet time, our daily devotions in the morning, or maybe at night if you're not a morning person like me. And then we forget about during the day that all of our time really is time that maybe should be brought before God. And so this ora et labora notion is sort of this third way between the two extremes of, contemplative quiet time and frantically working, and it's the idea of bringing those two together. Tish Harrison Warren writes, she's the author of Liturgy of the Ordinary, and she says, she says this in a compelling way. She says, I need a third way. Neither frantic activity nor escape from the workaday world. A way of working that is shaped by being blessed and sent. This third way is marked by freedom from compulsion and anxiety because it's rooted in benediction, God's blessing and love. But it also actively embraces God's mission in the world into which we are sent. So that third way is kind of what I want you all to think about and think about for your own work lives. How can we begin to be attentive to the ways in which God is already speaking to us? So as I mentioned, there are three practices that I want to talk about. The first is the practice of surrender. And for each of these kinds of practices, I'm going to try to give various examples from different people who have done it in different ways. And then I want to give you all just a couple of minutes to kind of practice it yourself at your tables. And at the end, have a little bit of conversation around what that might have looked like. So with this practice of surrender, it's the idea of giving up your work to God. And that giving up can happen at the beginning of the day, but it also can happen at waypoints along the way. Here's an example of somebody who I think frames this really, really well. This is a friend of mine, Matt, who lives in Seattle. And he works at the Seattle Vocational Institute and teaches art. This is an Instagram post that he posted, and as you can see, the picture is a kind of dingy stairwell. This stairwell, I'll read the post to you. He says, looking out the window from the stairwell of Seattle Vocational Institute, where in the mornings I teach computer tech classes, I pray in this stairwell every morning. It is my chapel. I pray for my students who come from all walks of life, mostly marginalized, immigrants, African Americans, Latinos, some who struggle with learning disabilities. I pray that I would serve them well, equip them with good knowledge, love them. Though in the distance, things are dim. Looking out that window, it's a fuzzy view. Things are dim, unclear. This morning, I again stand in the stairwell. This morning, I have work to do, the same work I've been doing, trying to be of service, create opportunities for all, loving others. This school is small, underfunded, unglamorous, and sometimes heartbreaking. But this morning, I am here. I recommit to this work, and the enemies of our work will have to shut us down or throw me out to stop me. And even then, I will find another way to keep going and doing the work of today. So I wonder, do you have a stairwell in your workplace? Or maybe you're working at home, and maybe you have a space there that is where you work. And is there something about that space, about that place, that can prompt you to surrender your work to God, that can remind you that God is in the midst of your work, and God wants you to be working towards God's purposes, whatever those might be in your particular workplace? Here's another picture. This is actually my office, a corner of my office. And you see a couple pictures on the wall on the right side. On the left is a painting. And I don't know if you can see real well, but I should have done a little bit of a close-up of this picture. This painting is called Holy Ground. It's painted by an artist named Kathy Self, who lives in the Denver area. And she actually painted it in response to 9/11. And her image of the Twin Towers in New York being a space of holy ground where the first responders were drawn to help people. But the second chapter of my book is actually called Workplace as Holy Ground, and it has nothing to do with 9/11. It's thinking about our workplace as a place that God encounters us. And it's really a reflection on, in my experience, of thinking about where does God engage with us? If you think about Scripture, Moses, when he was called, God calls him in the burning bush, and Moses sees it, and he's, can't quite figure out what's going on, and he goes over, and God tells him to take your sandals off because you're standing on holy ground. Where was Moses when he encounters God? He was in the wilderness. What was he doing in the wilderness? He was tending his sheep. He was doing his job. He was at work. He was at work, and God encounters him and says, the place that you're standing is holy ground. And so I started to think, what if my workplace was holy ground? What if it was a place that I encounter God and God encounters me? What does that mean to walk into my office at work and say, this is a place of holy ground? And so the picture, if you can see on the bottom corner there, is a pair of bare feet. And so for me, it's a reminder of Moses and taking off his sandals and being in the workplace and that being holy ground. And so I start to think, if my office is holy ground, what does that mean for the students who walk into it? Well, whether they know it or not, they are walking into holy ground. And so what does that mean for how I engage with them? What does that mean for how I think about them? It is a way for me to surrender this space to God and say, okay, God, this is your space. This is holy space. So what do you want me to do here? How do you want me to engage? How do you want me to interact with anybody who crosses the threshold of this space that is holy? Another surrender practice is surrendering the calendar. I don't know about you, but when I walk into my office and I glance over and I see that artwork and it reminds me, okay, this is holy ground, got to remember. And then I go sit down at my desk, which you didn't see a picture of. It's much messier than that corner of the office that you did see. And I turn on my computer, and kind of the first thing that pops up is my calendar and the list of things that might have to happen that day. This picture of calendar, by the way, is something I just found on the internet. It's Microsoft's, neutral calendar. My calendar is much more full than this, I have to tell you. And so I look at it, and sometimes my heart starts to beat a little bit fast. I'm like, oh man, I've got a lot of things going. And then I open up my Outlook, and my emails are all sitting there, and there's 400 since I left the night before. And again, my heart starts to beat really fast, and I'm like, wow, I've got a lot of things that are coming that I have to deal with, that I'm going to have to move really quickly to navigate. And one of the practices of surrender is to just say, okay, God, this is yours. This day is yours. This calendar is yours. What do you want me to do in these meetings? What do you want me to do with these emails? How do you want me to be? There's another guy up in the Northwest, Dan, who is a project manager at Microsoft. He manages a team of over 200 people around the world. And he begins almost all of his days opening up his calendar, sort of like this, except his is also much fuller. He pulls out his to-do list, and he prays over every task and every meeting that's going to come up for that day. And he asks God, what do you want me to do? This is yours. This is your day. How do you want me to live into it? So it's another way of surrendering. So I wonder for you, how much you pay attention to God in new ways, by giving him your to-do list, by giving him your calendar, by asking for God's help, asking what he would have you do with each day. So let me just briefly summarize this section, thinking about some prompts that might be useful for you all as you think about surrendering your work to God. That could be a place, whether it's a stairwell or an office space or your home, whatever that might be, where you do your work. What are some prompts in that place that can remind you to give that work up to God? Maybe it's a practice. We have, in our book, we have a chapter called Liturgy of Commute. And the idea there is, as you're going to work, how can you engage that process, that literal from your doorstep to your office? How can you use that time and engage in a liturgy of prayer, of reminder of different things that God might have for you in the coming day? So the Liturgy of Commute was really useful to me when I went into work, and then all of a sudden I was, walking from upstairs to downstairs, and my Liturgy of Commute got super short, and so that didn't work as well. And maybe it won't work for you, and that's okay. There's other options. There's other ideas. I actually have now changed a computer password that I have to a scripture verse, so that every time I'm opening up my computer, I'm reminded of God's words in Scripture. And so maybe you can think about what are some things that God might be having for you to say. You could type that every single time you open your computer. I have another friend, Jeff, who also lives in Seattle, that he has an office badge that he uses to get into his office every day, so he has to, scan his card. And every time he does that, he prays, "Oh, Lord, this is your space. I'm walking into holy ground. Remind me to see this place as the way that you see it." And so using that practice of swiping his badge is something that he does to surrender his day. Some prayers that you can engage in. You can engage in prayer over your calendar. You can engage in prayer over your to-do list. There's another woman I know who is a nurse, and she keeps a 3x5 handwritten card in her pocket of her scrubs in the hospital, and on that card she writes a psalm. So she just has it with her, and it just reminds her that God is with her, God has something for her. So lots of different ways that are very small, but that you can walk into the workplace with, that are helping you to surrender that experience to God. So I want you all to take about 2 minutes right now, and just do this by yourselves at your tables. I want you to think about, what are some places that you regularly inhabit in your daily work? Are there ways that these places can prompt you to surrender your work to God? So that's question number one. You can actually choose all of these questions if you have time in 2 minutes, or if you get stuck on one, you can choose one and stick on it. That's totally fine. Second question, are there any mundane activities that you regularly engage in that could become prompts to remind you that God is with you in your work? Whether that's a computer password, whether that's swiping a card, what might it be? So what are some mundane activities in your work? And then thirdly, take a minute to open your calendar or your to-do list for next week and ask God what God's agenda is for you and who or what God would have you pay attention to next week. So 2 minutes, you can choose one or all. And I'm going to just give you some quiet time, and then we'll come back in just a couple minutes. So you guys are lucky that you're not my students, because I cold call them. But I am wondering if anybody would be brave enough to share something that they thought about, or that they wrote down, or that occurred to them in this process of thinking about surrender. Yeah, go ahead. Mike. So he's in construction and says that when they have to make allocation decisions, financial allocation decisions, I'm assuming, which happen virtually daily, that those decision points will be opportunities for him to surrender that decision to God and ask God, what would you have us do in this moment? It's a great example. Any others? I don't see anyone, jumping to raise their hand. All right, one more over here, and then.
I'm a writer, and something that I do, I borrowed from Bach, which they say steal from the best. But every time I start a story or a script, the first thing that goes on the page are the letters JJ, which stands for Jesu Juvo, or Jesus Help Me. And the last three letters of any script after the end is SDG, which is Soli Deo Gloria, to God be the glory. And that's just provides a quick visual reminder that everything I'm doing falls inside something bigger.
Yeah. I love it, and I also love the fact that you stole it from Bach, because there's something nice about having others who have gone before us, who have done these things, and in some ways there is nothing new under the sun. And so trying to think about, well, what have others modeled for us that we can steal? Okay, so I said there were 3 practices. I want to move on quickly. I'm gonna move over this one fairly quickly, not because it's not important, but because I know that another speaker later today is actually going to attend to this in a little bit more detail. But I do think that lament is something that has been really powerful for me over the past 2 years. There has been a lot of changes and a lot of moments that have not felt good, that have been really challenging in my work, in our lives, and Lament is this idea, I think, of telling the truth to God and not pretending that it's so great, but really saying, hey, this is how I'm experiencing this moment, and it's really hard, and I don't feel good about it. There are ways. I love the fact that we have the Psalms in Scripture, because we see all these examples, again, sort of like Bach, all these examples of ways that other people who have followed God have tried to express their emotions. And some of those emotions are really positive, but some are really not. And that gives us a lot of freedom, that this makes it into Scripture, that we too can express our emotions that aren't very positive to God. So we can express our sorrow, our heartbreak, our anger, our frustration, and sometimes maybe our rage. There are really challenging experiences that many of us have at work. We might have been treated unfairly. We might have failed at something we thought we were going to succeed at. We might have lost a job that we wanted to have. We might have difficult relationships in the workplace. We might have been experiencing harassment or discrimination at work. And God knows that stuff. And these are things that we can bring to God and say, I'm at my wit's end. I don't know what to do. I'm frustrated. I'm angry. Please hear me. Hear my voice. I was thinking about having you all do an exercise related to lament that was going through a psalm and actually adapting it for yourself, a psalm of lament. I'm not going to do that because I talked to Michaela O'Donnell Long, who's speaking later today, and she is going to do something very similar to that. So I will not do that, but I will ask you to just take maybe 1 minute on this one to think about this practice. How could you lament? What is heartbreaking about your work? What frustrations are you experiencing? Are there any places that you get stuck at work? What's happening in your body when you think about these things? So pay attention to your own physical body. What emotions are you feeling? What's tense? What are you irritated by, angered by, frustrated by, stressed out by? And then what do you want to lament to God? Listen to how God might respond. So I'll give you about 1 minute. Again, you can use these questions any way that's useful for you. You can jot things down or not. But take a minute and think about how you might lament in your work. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. This one might be a little trickier, but does anyone want to share their thoughts or experiences with respect to lament? I don't always get lots. Oh, okay. So we do have a brave person up front who wants to share.
Hi. Can anyone hear me? I'm Alex. I would say when I have to work nights and weekends unexpectedly, I'm a consultant, so sometimes that can kind of just come up.
Yeah.
And it can happen for a couple of different, couple of weeks at a time. So I would say, that's a frustration. I get headaches or my stomach gets tight. So I don't know if you all experience that, but so I would say that I would do lament that to God. Like it feels like the job expects the job to be my life, and then my life outside of work is sort of, they allow me to have that rather than the other way around. So
yeah. That's definitely, I think, challenges of overwork can fit into that category of lament. I actually started thinking about the whole thought process of integrating faith and work for me started about 23, 24 years ago in my own life when I had very little kids. And I all of a sudden realized that I just had absolutely no margin in this idea of, well, wait a minute, God talks about Sabbath. What does that mean? And I really, frankly, had no idea how to practice it. But so like a good academic, I wrote some papers on it. But that process, frankly, was really, really instrumental for me in terms of changing the rhythm of my life and trying to preserve some of that time. Now, when kids are little and they have diapers that need to be changed and they need to eat at least 3 times a day, it's like, well, there is really no break. Sunday doesn't mean a day of rest in that respect. So I can get that sense of that the demands of the job sometimes are overwhelming or can be. And that is something that at times is lamentable. And lots of other things as well. All right, let's move on to the third practice, which is the practice of gratitude and celebration. And I want to think about, we often think about gratitude or celebration when we have something good to be grateful for or something to celebrate. And I want us to think about how do we respond to successes in our lives? What's the first thing that comes to mind when things go really well? Do you want to tell somebody about it? Do you intuitively or automatically think to thank God for it? What kinds of things do we do? In Deuteronomy, and this is right before the Hebrew people are about to enter into the Promised Land, and Moses is kind of giving a recap of the previous 40 years, and he tells the people, be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I'm giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So he's telling them, look, success has a downside. Success has a potentially really significant downside, and is that we forget God. We think we've done it. And one of the things I think about gratitude is that it's an antidote to this. It helps us to remember. So it helps us focus on that remembrance concept. How do we respond to success? I think one of the healthiest ways, and a way that is scriptural, is to give thanks. Giving thanks helps to keep us a little bit humble. Helps us to recognize that success is not all about us. It's not because we are so smart or so good. Successes are not only our own. Successes are a confluence of a lot of things, including God's grace. And so when we have success, how do we respond to it? We want to give thanks in order to cultivate humility, but also to cultivate this identity, that the way that God is trying to shape us in our lives. And there are a couple of types of gratitude. There's two ways to think about giving thanks. One is to express our thanks upwardly to God, but the other is to express our thanks to others and to celebrate successes with others. And so I want to talk about both of those a little bit. The appropriate response to generosity from someone else is gratitude back to them. And if we think about our successes as a function of God's generosity to us, we want to express our gratitude towards the giver and about the gift itself. Expressing thanks to others is something that, we're taught as kids. I'm still actually trying to get my 17-year-old to say thank you immediately after, still 17 years. I tell him, really, we've been telling you this for a long time. Anyway, we tell our kids to say thank you, to say please and thank you. Those are, very, very early prompts that we try to get them to say. What is really interesting to me is that there's research on this. And the research asks, how important do you think it is for somebody else to get your thanks? How much do you think that impacts them? And most people say, it's probably nice. It's probably a good thing that they hear thanks, but it's probably not a huge deal. And then they go to people who have just received thanks, whether that's a thank you card or a thank you gift of some kind, and they ask them, how would you rate your experience given that you've just gotten this? And given that you've just received thanks. And the people who are on the receiving end of thanks rate their experience much more highly than the people who have just given the thanks. So there's a little bit of a disconnect in terms of our perceptions of what thanks does. We tend to think it's not that big of a deal to other people, but it turns out that it is a big deal, that people actually experience quite a bit of joy in that process of receiving thanks. So I think that's important to know, that thanks is something that I think there's a sort of an economy of thanks that is virtuous. In other words, it creates positive feelings. So when you get something that's good, you say thank you back, and the person who receives the thanks actually gets almost a double gift, right? They've been able to give you something, but they also receive the thanks in a important way. It's important also to publicly thank people. This is one of the things that we can talk about that enhances the value of thanks. At an individual level, we can publicly thank people for their contributions. We can celebrate their accomplishments. And then similarly at the team level, we can do this. We can celebrate achievements, acknowledge achievements, and celebrate task completion. So think about in your own workplaces, who are some people around you who maybe contribute? How often do you say thank you to them? What are some of the ways in which you might express your gratitude to them? And particularly if you are in a leadership role, do you do it publicly? Are there ways that you acknowledge other people's accomplishments in the workplace? Do you make a habit of doing this on a regular basis? If I told you about a pill that you could take that would make you happy, that would help you sleep better at night, that would diminish mental health concerns, that would make you in better shape physically, that would lead to better friendships, that would make you more empathetic, and that would give you resilience in the face of failure, how much would you pay for that pill, for that prescription? The reason I ask is because each one of these things on this list here, more positive emotions, higher levels of happiness, better sleep, better mental health, better physical health, etc., each of these are associated with gratitude. When people are asked to keep gratitude journals, so every day write down 3 to 10 things that you're thankful for in that day, and they're tracked over time, what the researchers find is that typically they don't measure all these things at the same time, they measure one of them, but study after study after study shows there are these incredibly positive outcomes associated with expressing gratitude, with being thankful. And this doesn't, the research that's been done on this is not done in a faith context. This is just people making a list of things that they're grateful for at the end of the day. I have a colleague who has a little alarm on his phone at 11 p.m. I'm usually in bed by 11 p.m., but he's not. And he has a little alarm on his phone, so it's a prompt before he goes to bed, and he has a little alarm that says gratitude on it. And so it's a reminder to him that when that alarm goes off to think about that day and what he's grateful for. And he also probably experiences most of these wonder drug kinds of outcomes, which is a little irritating to me because I'm not always as good at gratitude as some other people are. I try to remind myself of doing this on a more regular basis because God calls us to do it. And I think because God calls us to do it, there are these really positive outcomes associated with it. So I think gratitude is a really amazing kind of activity and behavior. So I want you, again, practice, I'm going to give you about 2 minutes. I want you to think about 3 possibilities. Either make a list of 5 things that you're grateful for in your work, in your co-curricular activities, in your work day. Talk to God about how you can go about giving thanks and celebrating those things. So make a list and then ask God, how can I acknowledge this better? Or make a list of 3 people who have had a positive impact on your trajectory in life or in your workplace. What would you say to them in a thank you note? So write down 3 names and then maybe start to write a note to them. Third option is list some ways that you can celebrate your gratitude. For example, taking somebody to coffee, sending an email, recognizing somebody in a public setting. So choose one and make a plan to do it. So what are you going to do this next week to acknowledge your gratitude towards somebody else? You'll have 2 minutes to do this. If you get through your one, maybe choose one of the others. See how many you can get through. And then I'm going to ask for a couple of examples. Okay, your 2 minutes are up. Anybody willing to share? Yeah, in the back in the middle. We've got
every time when anybody help me, whether at work or anywhere, I immediately buy snacks for them, or and or sometimes when I make observation that someone just helped me, say, oh, I would like to have a bottle of water, I immediately bought a bottle of water to that person that just helped me. So I just, to show my gratitude and thanks.
What kinds of responses have you gotten from people in doing that?
Oh, thank you. Oh, you don't have to, oh, but thank you, know.
That's a great example. Anybody else? Share a quick example over here.
When I do my weekly planning, which I tend to do very early on a Saturday morning for the week ahead, the first thing I look back on is I have a gratitude list that obviously I maintain. And the second thing is that when we moved here, which was 16 years ago, I've actually kept a list of every time God's done something. I call it the Hand of God list. And it goes back 16 years now. And it just takes me 5 minutes just to reflect down it. And all that you said there, that gratitude. So
you have physical and mental health, and you have all the things. Then.
Well, I don't know about that, but it's just so true what you said.
Yeah, and 5 minutes in a week is all it takes. It really does not take a lot of time. It's a very, very powerful activity, a very powerful practice. I want to leave with some questions for discussion, and I thought maybe you could take a couple minutes around your tables. Those of you who are in the back who are not at a table, there is space up here if you want to fill in, or you can group up with folks near you. But I want you to think about several different questions. Have you been in a situation where your contributions did not seem valued or celebrated? How did that impact your attitude or your work? Have you been in a context where gratitude was regularly expressed and your contributions were celebrated? What was that experience like? And then maybe just thinking about this experience in the last 2 minutes, what did you notice about yourself as you were practicing gratitude? Was it easy or difficult to come up with things that you're thankful for, and why do you think that is? Or what are some ways that you could make gratitude part of the rhythm of your everyday life? So what do you need in order to practice gratitude regularly? So I just want to give you a couple minutes to chat with folks around your tables, to talk about gratitude, talk about some of your experiences with it, and then we're going to shift and move on to our next speaker. So.